How do we, what? I'll play adaptations. Yeah, whatever. You guys want to hear some lock rap?
Yeah.
No, I'm doing it. I'm doing it.
Yes, do it.
Let me see. I don't even know if I remember all the lyrics. Champion, yeah, that means I win. Gonzo Bogota set the pins. Clock ticks down, I'm lost in a trance. Tickling the tumblers, making them dance. Tension, like a butterfly. Top of the keyway, high and dry. Plenty of room for my picks to move. The tighter the warning, the smoother the groove. Falset, just give me time. Lighten up the tension, I'll be just fine. With Hobbs, Pettis, and Yale before me, I'm bound by history on my way to glory. This lock is nasty, I'm a rope-a-dopin'. Largest set, push, push, open. There you go. Oh, man. All right, well, while he's doing, I don't know what he's doing. Okay, so, origin of the, here he is. Oh, listen to that. It's your conference, too.
Her food is not allowed to the party. While you wait.
That's pretty good.
Okay.
All right, dude. Yeah, I'm totally ready.
Todd, are you ready? Cool. Okay.
All right.
So I would normally introduce the talks, but that seems a bit redundant. So my cohort, yes, I'm waiting for her to get to slide 1 like an adult.
What's happening?
What are you doing?
I'm hitting F5.
You were so bad at it.
What did you do?
What did you do?
What did you do?
Well, it's already up. Return.
Oh, Matt. That was confusing. You were confused. Now you're not on the first slide anymore. Can we do page up? Does that do it? Oh, I don't know.
Okay, we figured out how computers work. Okay, so I will sit.
Thank you. I totally owned my own Linux box.
All right. Okay, so I would normally give some introduction, but I'm Datagram. This is Schuyler. If you'd like to know where your picks are, ask them after the talk. And we're going to talk about disk detainer locks, which are a very particular type of lock. And we're going to talk about how they're different, how they're better, how they're worse. And the reason I think both of us wanted to do this talk is because we focus a lot on the pin tumblers that we use. And then, you know, when we go to other countries, we go, hey, wait, they don't really use the same stuff we do. And disk detainers are slowly getting more and more popular around the world because a lot of the companies that make them make specifically high security disk detainers. And in Asia, the companies that make disk detainers make the worst locks ever, but they also coincidentally are the least expensive locks ever. And in places where nobody wants to afford a lock that's more than €1, this is what they buy.
And we're seeing a ton of the kind of middle, like not very good but passable locks pouring into the country right now. We'll talk a little bit about bike locks later on, or I will, and I don't know, I'd say we're on the verge of another Big Pen situation with like Kryptonite and those other brands because nobody's actually moving to a new generation of their not very good locks. All right.
Okay. So the main thing is...
Is there only one mic?
Yes.
Okay.
What are we just have to get in close.
Yeah.
What are disk detainer locks? So disk detainer locks are a specific type of lock mechanism. So all the locks you have on your doors are probably pin tumbler locks, which means they use pins to prevent you from rotating the plug before you have the correct key inserted, or obviously lockpicking and all that other stuff. But we'll assume with the correct key. And so disk detainers are very visually distinct. Just from looking at it, you go, oh, what's that crazy lock? And so the majority of them are this half circle thing like in the center, but there's also the more exotic varieties, such as on the left. Actually, if you look in the game room has nothing but disk detainer padlocks. And if you look at the vending machines farther down the hall, they have nothing but disk detainer padlocks as well. Or excuse me, cylinders built into the machine. So
Good looking man.
the way this started was actually very old. So a lot of people assume that anything that's not a pin tumbler lock must be new, right? But that's not true. So these are pretty close to about when pin tumblers started to become popular, which is the late 1800s. So the first person to invent the disc detainer, as we know it today, is this Emil Henriksen, and he founded a company called Abloy, which is now one of the biggest lock companies in the world.
They own everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so here's some examples of the early Abloy padlocks. They look very different than the padlocks we use, and as well as obviously the keys, and the keyholes look very different. And so here's an example of some keys. And so the general concept behind disc detainer locks is that instead of raising components, like most of our common American locks, we rotate components. And when all the components are rotated in the proper position, then the lock can open. And so here you can see the way they accomplish this is by putting angled cuts on the key. And when you turn it, obviously the components will stop at a specific position depending on the angle. So here's an example of all the discs and components inside a disc detainer lock. Here's an example of all the discs inside. And so you see each disc has a little keyhole cut out. Some of them have this little tab, and all of them have this little cut over on the side. And the cut is what tells the lock when it's properly rotated. To prevent picking, a lot of these locks will have false gates. So, obviously if they're nothing but correct gates, it would be considerably easier to just try everything until you feel it click into place, and then you know that disc is set in the right spot. So most, if not all, serious disc detainer manufacturers will include some form of false gates to deter this kind of stuff. And one of the things that is the main reason that disc locks are becoming more popular is because they don't use a pin mechanism. And as a result of not using a pin mechanism, they can't be bumped. And everybody, in our way of looking at things, we go, oh, well, bumping was a big problem, so I want a lock that can't be bumped. So this will not be bumped, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're buying the good lock. So think of it in terms of, all our computer security stuff. We don't look at just one specific attack and then say, well, as long as I'm protected from that, I'm fine. You have to look at, obviously, the big picture.
Okay, so how these actually function. So this is an Abloy Classic style disc. You have your open half moon, which is your keyhole. This shape will correspond to the shape on the... Yeah, awesome. Are we just going to pass them around, you think? What do you want to do? Okay, cool. So, yeah, we have the open half moon keyhole, which corresponds to the shape of the key. You have your true gate, the gate being what a sidebar, which you'll see in a second, is going to drop into, and your tab or stopper, which is going to align things, limit rotation, and there's your zero discs, which you'll see in a couple of seconds here, have a specific purpose for that. Okay. So you have your sidebar. The sidebar of the lock sits between the plug of the lock and the housing of the lock. This is what's preventing the plug from turning. This is what's preventing anything from turning at all. Now the sidebar wants to go into the gate. That's all there is to it. So when you are misaligned here, the sidebar can't quite go in. As a result, the plug can't rotate, blah, blah, blah. Here with the proper key in and rotated to the proper angle, the sidebar can drop into place and the whole system can turn freely. Okay, let's Alt-Tab. Bam. Boom. Alright, you do whatever.
It's difficult decisions.
No!
I've never opened that on this laptop, so.
I mean, I feel like we couldn't have given a better talk than the Stilt Walker talk anyway. That was so good. Okay, so this is an Avis Plus that we're looking at. The concept is exactly the same though. I was recently learning how to use Blender. I really like it. I recommend it. Anyway, so here are your key. You'll notice the different angles cut into the key. The angle cut into the key corresponds directly with the number of degrees off from center the gate is. This is just the double ball mechanism inside of the padlock. Double ball mechanisms are awesome. They're perfectly shim-proof, but nothing to do with this standards. All right, here comes the important part. Let's look inside. So the reason that the, yeah, awesome, right there. All right, so the reason that the sidebar pushes itself into the discs whatsoever is if you look right here, this large piece of metal is actually a protrusion from the plug. When the zero disc, in this case the disc back here, and there's another disc right at the front, when these are fully rotated by the key, they actually collide with that tab, beginning to put a turning pressure on the plug itself. By putting a turning pressure on the plug, that then transfers that pressure to the sidebar, and as you'll see right now, the sidebar is mounted in an angled chamber, and so it wants to slide out of that chamber into the gates if they're available to it. Yes. Dun, dun, dun. There's the chamber. There it slides. There we go.
And I passed around a couple different disc detainers. They're all made by Abloy, and they all basically work on the same principle. There's some minor differences in the way that each of the things I passed around works, but they're basically the same.
Does that make sense? You are welcome to tell us if it doesn't.
Play the video again.
Okay, straight through. Just let it go.
Yeah, let's see. Yeah, now that we know what we're looking at.
No problem.
Let's start at the beginning.
It is. Yes. That resource will be at the end of this. Man, that is pretty directional microphone. Oh, there it is. Yeah. I'm good. I'm good. I feel like I should be providing commentary.
You're fine. They're watching.
They're watching.
They're good. You guys good? Shut up. I'm watching. So feel free to ask us questions. We're very open to.
So that wouldn't work on the space station because
What?
zero G.
Well, it's still mechanical
I mean,
force moving everything.
This has nothing to do with
It,
gravity.
it doesn't drop in; it's forced in.
Oh, the spring? Not
Correct.
the-
The sidebar is forced in. Every time you try and turn it together, it tries to push it in. Just like when you try and turn the key on a pin tumbler lock, it tries to move. But if there's anything blocking, then it can't go in the right position.
Word.
Okay. So here's some examples of different sidebars for different models, and they're all pretty much the same thing. It's just a bar that interfaces with the gates on each disk. And the only real reason for variety is one is sort of security. So for example, you can see the difference between the one on the left top and left bottom. So the reason they changed this, and the reason it has a hook in future designs, this is the Abloy Classic on the top left, and this is, I believe, the Abloy Disc Lock, which is a later model. The reason they did this was because if you don't have that little hook, you could just drill a small hole in the face of the lock and take the sidebar out, and then there's nothing preventing you from rotating the cylinder and thus unlocking the lock. So by adding this little hook, you'd have to drill all the way through, and then that could be harder depending on, they'll put steel discs to make it harder to drill and so on. So here's an example of a Abloy profile. This is it with the sidebar in the cylinder. This is the sidebar removed, and all the discs are misaligned. So you can see there's some false gates, some are in the true gates, but obviously the sidebar is not going to be able to retract with all these mixed up like that. And here's them all correctly aligned. So they provide that nice little pocket for the sidebar to fall into. So one of the questions is, okay, well that's really cool. I get how it works. I get why you can't bump it, and I could see how it might be different to pick. But what if I have like a large institution and I want a master kit? So there's several approaches. In the photo, the main thing they do is they just add extra cuts. So this would be, I don't know the actual numbers, but let's say this is a 2-cut and a 3-cut. And so either of those would work depending on the rotation. What they could also do, which is slightly worse, is just make a really long gate. And the reason that's slightly worse is because this little dip right here will actually prevent the sidebar from retracting fully if there's enough of them, because it's slightly higher. So it's different. But it's just an example. This cutout here, if you're wondering what that is, and on the fourth one as well, that little extra shape is so that trying to move this with manipulation tools will be more difficult because you have less room to grab onto. And there's actually a funny story. I didn't bring the tool because it shames me to look at it, but there's a company that makes a pick for the Abloy Classic, and it's the bronze padlock being passed around. And these are discs from that. And so the reason it sucks is because they didn't account for these discs, which are in like every lock ever. And so the tool is like 1 millimeter or half a millimeter too short to pick up these discs that have the anti-manipulation feature, which I find hilarious because it's one of the basic fundamental features of the lock. And for some reason they just didn't account for that. We have some photos of picking tools, and that one's included later so you could see what it looks like. And then there's other variations. So that was the basic, and now they add more to it. So Abloy's next idea was to add warding to the key. So if you remember, the previous lock just had the half circle. And so that gives you a pretty good range of movement with manipulation tools to try and pick the lock. And so they started adding profiles in anything past the classic model. And they can do pretty extensive warding. So not only can they do warding that's the full length of the keyblade, but they can also do warding that's just in the back or in the middle of the lock. And the way that they do that is that as you're inserting the key, you're passing through each of these keyholes on each disc. And somewhere further in the back, the keyhole will have a reduced area. So your key has to match that hole farther back in. And so you can see some examples here, like such as this third one has a partial back keyway cut, same as here, same as here. And so there's a lot of variation, even though it's such a simple concept. And here's some better pictures. So this is a full length ward, and here's just in the back. And this one on the bottom has no warding, on this side at least. The next lock Abloy made, and really, like, it might sound funny that we're just talking about Abloy right now, but they're really the company that made these locks popular.
And remain the top of the heap.
Yeah, and really the only reason other companies make these is because Abloy was so successful. So what's kind of funny is that Abloy is 100 years ahead of everybody, and right now everybody else who's making disc locks are kind of catching up. And slowly they start to resemble the more modern Abloy model.
Yeah, it's painful how many of them just resemble that same exact 1907 model without any of the very, very competent iterations that Abloy made over the years.
Yeah. So this is the Disc-Lock Pro. I believe the one main feature of this was that this was the first Abloy that you could turn both ways to unlock. So you could have a lock and an unlock feature. The earlier ones don't do that because if you try and rotate the other way, then the gates on each disc are not in the right position. So you have to account for both rotations.
Still very few are able to do that.
Yeah. And so here's an example, and here's the discs. They look pretty much the same, but they're slightly different. Did you talk about washers?
I have not yet.
Okay. So these are the discs, and then these are the washers. And the reason there's washers is because you have this big stack of discs. And when you put your key in and try and turn, you don't want discs to be stuck together, and then your key cut picks up two discs and pushes it too far or too short. So there's washers in between every disc in a disc lock to ensure that each key cut only picks up a single disc. So here's an example again of all the discs aligned. This is actually one of the locks that's getting passed around. Similar again. What this added, this is the Abloy exec, they added this dimple. And so what they found was what you could do on earlier models is you can insert the key partially and then try and turn all the way. And that's obviously not what you want for normal use. And it also slightly helps against manipulation because you don't want them to be able to test discs without having whatever it is all the way inserted, as well as accommodating for this. So it's not a big security feature, it's more of a usability feature, but it does have implications for later models. So here's an example of those discs. And again, they're all very similar. These can also turn both ways. Ooh, I pushed something. And the way that the key retention mechanism works is that it's just these little pieces, and when you try and turn your key, it tries to push in, and if there's a key is partially inserted, there should be material there, which will not allow this to retract, which will in turn not allow the cylinder to turn.
So those are going straight into that dimple, allowing them to retract in. So passive element, if you just removed that section from a key that you made, it would still fall into place. It is just looking for a lack of material at that point in the key.
And the other thing is that these, from the disk lock on, the abloy keys were also reversible, so you could insert it in either orientation, which is obviously not the case with the half circle. No longer the newest, but their most well-known currently is the Abloy Protec, and this is what's used on the vending machines over in the hallway. Yes, it's a very strange-looking Abloy Protec keyway, but it is a Protec. And these are pretty interesting in how they work. So they look very similar to all the other stuff we've looked at. You see they have two dimples, and the discs themselves look much more intimidating, but they're essentially the same thing. What really is interesting is they also have this disc or key retaining mechanism. They use ball bearings in this, I think, because it takes up a little bit less space. It's also probably cheaper. Same idea as the exec, but what's very special is that they have what's called the disc blocking system. So you talk about that.
Oh.
I have a cutaway.
This is the part that you should talk about.
Okay, super. Wait a second.
What if I play the video? No, you want to talk about it first.
Whatever.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So the way the disk blocking system works is that in an ideal lock, you're not allowed to test disks individually. And when I say test, is you're not allowed to manipulate a disk individually to find where the correct position is, because that's obviously not how any keys work. And when you pick a pin tumbler lock, that's what you do, is you're testing each pin stack individually and setting them individually, and then you open the lock. You know, how many of you have ever used a pin tumbler tool where you raise everything at once? It's called the key, so you've all used it, but it's not the same thing. So the way that the Protec works is it has these serrations on the bottoms of the discs, you can see over here, as well as these two return bars. And so what happens is you insert your key and you turn, and as you start turning at a certain point, these bars will lock up into these serrations on the bottom of each disc, which will in turn keep them in place. Okay? And so at that point, then they can touch the sidebar and see if they're in the correct position. So it's the idea is that it makes it considerably harder to manipulate, because now you have to move everything together. And that makes it much more time consuming to try and pick the lock. Because you know, when we pick a lock, you go, okay, I'm going to move this, see how it feels, move this, see how it feels. Consider doing that, you have to move everything at once to the correct position. That's considerably more difficult.
Separating tension from manipulation of the tumblers is the holy grail of making a mechanical lock. What we've been doing since the 1830s is called the tentative method, where we apply tension to the tumblers. We apply direct force to those, and then we manipulate each one of them individually to feel how they react. What Abloy have succeeded in doing is make sure that we cannot apply tension to then test what we feel from the cylinder. As the moment that you apply that force, you can no longer manipulate the individual tumblers, and you can manipulate the individual tumblers, but as you manipulate them, you can feel nothing because you can't apply any force to the sidebar. So they've hit this holy grail moment.
Yeah, and even though that, as Schuyler says, it's a holy grail, it's the ideal, it's the future, is what we want to have is this sort of thing, because it makes so many things more difficult. It's not perfect. There's been problems with it in the past few years. For example, there's a specific model of the padlock with Abloy Protecs where the disc in the front would have enough of a hole that you could put a wire in and directly tension the actual sidebar, overcoming this. So there's been problems with it, and you know, it's not perfect, but so far it's exceptional considering all the other disc locks on the market.
This will be the that one.
Is this the marketing one?
Yeah.
Can you talk?
Yeah, totally. Okay, this is cut together from some Protec marketing footage, actually. So this is just the lock in its assembly. Technically advanced construction. So the return bar, or the blocking bars here, actually make these locks a lot easier to assemble than their predecessors too. They not only dramatically advance the security of the lock, but they make them a lot nicer to maintain. I had to put together some discs in an Abus earlier today, and it's just a debacle. Okay, this next bit is actually kind of cool because the interior radii of the key, the cuts on the key, actually manipulate two different sections of the disks. So the number 1 cuts and the number 2 cuts operate on this exterior surface. Whereas 3 through 6 actually spin a little bit further, and you're going to see 6 in a second here. 6 is actually just avoiding any interaction whatsoever. Down in the lower right corner. Because the 6 is directly aligned to the sidebar to begin with. And lastly is just an animation of those blocking bars so you can see them in action.
Do you have JK stuff?
I do not.
If you guys want to see a slightly better representation of this, you can go to theamazingking.com. And he's a friend of ours who has made very, very nice 3D models of this, so you can see all the different parts working together. And they're all uploaded on his website. So theamazingking.com.
Cool, that's funny.
Are there any questions?
About the Protec, Abloy, etc.? I think we're about to dive into attacks and other stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. All right, so the Abus Plus. Abus Plus and some other Detainer locks have been a pet project of mine for most of last year. Nothing too crazy about them. We looked at the model of them earlier. The word that says housing is supposed to say plug, forgive that. As I was saying earlier, the angles cut into the key correspond directly to the degree of the gate along the exterior of the disk. So you have your 0 disk and your profile disk. They'll be at opposite ends of the plug. Both of which are going to put pressure directly on the sidebar being turned by the uncut portion of the key. This was the video you watched earlier. I'm just putting it in slightly different terms right now. Okay. I'll talk about picking in a second. Okay. Those slides do pick up. Go ahead.
So most of the locks we talk about, in fact all of them, they're very specific to door hardware or padlocks. There's one lock in particular that's very interesting. You want to pass it around?
Yep.
Do you have the...
Yeah, he coded me his.
One lock that's very interesting is the Lagarde 2200, and it's made specifically for safes and vaults. We're passing one around now. What's kind of funny is that this key is actually the smallest key you can buy. And this is, I believe, the 8-inch, and it goes up to something ridiculous like 2 feet. And so the reason for that is obviously you have the lock inside the vault, and you put your giant key through, and then eventually the tip of the key gets to the lock, and then you can actually turn it. And we have one in the Lockpicking Village, but the giant keys have a removable tip, so that when you, if I know how to remove the key, obviously you don't want to carry around a 2-foot key in your pocket. That might be slightly prohibitive. So what they have is a tip that you can remove. You keep the tip in your pocket because that's the important part, and then you just keep the long key rod, in the storage closet next to the vault or whatever. Funny story about that. There was a story that's very famous now that the book Flawless is written about this big diamond heist in Antwerp, and the guards were super lazy and left the 2-foot key just in the closet with the tip attached. So I don't know that it was this particular lock, but there's variations upon a theme, and that was a fun part of that story. So this is essentially very similar. It's sort of a hybrid of the disk detainers we've been talking about and standard combination safe locks. And again, we have standard combination safe locks in the Lockpicking Village if you'd like to learn more about them.
They're made explicitly to fit into that footprint.
Yeah. So it's slightly different. We have all our disks underneath this portion here. And then we have this big arm that goes into them, and it fulfills the same role as a sidebar. There's also some additional security mechanisms, such as this piece here is a relocker, so that if the back is knocked off, then the lock should lock up. Here's a picture of the key, and it's essentially the same thing. We just have these slightly different length cuts, and that translates to different positioning of the disks when you rotate the key. Here are the disks themselves, as well as the washers in between each of them. You can see they're a little bit different. They also have this cutout here as well as some holes. So there's 2 reasons for this. The cutout down at the bottom is for rekeying. The cutouts at the top are to distribute weight evenly along the disk. So a problem with traditional safe locks is in like pre-World War II, they'd find if you were on a big boat for the Navy, locks would just kind of open. And they couldn't figure out why for a long time. And what happened was just the natural vibration of the ship would slowly rotate all these discs in the combination lock, and it would eventually open because they'd eventually all go to the right position, which is putting all the gates up.
Yeah,
And
so the least material was facing up, and if your locking bar was directly vertically above it,
Yeah. So now all modern safe locks do this to distribute weight evenly along each disc.
the rekeying is very cool. All you're actually doing is slightly pulling that arm back, which allows the inner wheel to rotate around the outer disc, changing the position of that gate relative to how the key interacts with it.
This lock also uses false gates, of course. They go, unlike the other Detainers, these go around the entire diameter of whatever. They go all the way around the disc. And then there's obviously a single
Circumference. That's how long
a
it took
single
me to
true
figure
gate.
circumference.
Circumference, yes. And so beside that, there's a million shitty ripoffs.
Yeah, I'll pass around a shitty ripoff.
Yeah, and they're mostly Asian made. Again, I said this because
Are locks getting
they
to you
sell.
guys yet?
I gave each row one, so.
No, I keep giving them.
Okay, so there's a lot of these, and pretty much if they're not these couple brands we talked about, they're probably really, really bad. And so the reason they're really bad, we don't have pictures, is because typically they don't use false gates. They don't use any sort of key retention. Any of the features we talked about, except having discs, they probably don't use, which makes them very bad.
And they usually have very bad tolerances as well, which we'll talk about in a minute.
Yeah.
What's up next?
Do we have the picture of the broken sidebar?
Picture of the broken sidebar.
Okay.
I don't
So
know.
there's a funny story. We had friends in Malaysia at a security
Oh.
conference, and the Solex lock here and variants of it are just everywhere. And they went to a locksmith to ask him, hey, how would you open one of these? Because they're lock guys and they want to know this stuff and they want to meet local locksmiths. And the locksmith just kind of laughed and pulled out an Allen wrench. And he says, well, you just put it in and then you turn really hard. And they sent me some of these that had been opened this way. Essentially, they just force the sidebar into the brass of the discs and make a gate forcibly. And it looks really funny. And if you look on my website, there's some photos of just this bent sidebar with all these little notches forced into it. And that's apparently considered a legitimate attack in Asia, is carry around an Allen wrench and open whatever you want.
The higher security locks have fallen to the same problems.
Yeah. It's considerably harder with some of the other stuff we've talked about, but because they use obviously slightly better materials, slightly better tolerances.
I'm thinking Fichet in particular.
Yes.
Yeah.
So now let's talk about ways that we can open these locks.
Word.
And as a slight preface, don't do these on locks you don't own or have permission to pick. So the first question is, what do you use? Because you go into Lockpicking Village, you see the strips of metal that we use as picks to open the pin tumbler locks and wafer locks and warded locks. They're all fairly similar. But these locks use very specific tools. And the reason for that is because there's a disc in the lock that provides tension as well as the discs you want to move into position to open it. So you need to be doing two things at once. And in pin tumbler lockpicking, we accomplish this with a separate tension tool. But because of the way the keyway works, we can't really do that. And because we're tensioning against a component, we have to have this kind of two-in-one tool. It's very similar to lever locks, which are an older type of lock that are popular in certain parts of Europe. And so essentially what it is just the pick is a combination of a tensioner and something to manipulate each disc. And they vary quite a bit because of the positioning of where you have to tension. So in some locks you need to tension the disc right at the front, and in some locks you need to tension the disc all the way in the back, and in some somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, those are the real dick locks.
Yeah. And so here is a photo of a pick for the Avis Plus, which he has,
Yep.
which we will be picking, I believe. And Schuyler will tell you more about it.
Okay, so again, Avis Plus was one of my pet projects a lot of last year. Jaakko Fagerlund, good friend of ours, Finnish guy. As they say in rally kart racing, if you want to win, hire a Finn. Good phrase. Okay, just a nicer version of his same tool. And actually, there's an even nicer version of his same tool sitting at that table. I'm not going to ask you to pass it around because it's the only one I know of in the country at the moment. But it is, I thought that it was the ugliest thing I had ever seen, but it feels amazing in the lock. Yeah, go ahead. Okay, so the really important thing about Yako's tool is that it isn't just a 2-in-1 pick. It doesn't just apply tension and then manipulate each of the individual tumblers. Those markings also let you know exactly, yeah, it lets you decode the lock as you're picking it. So by aligning the long straight line on the barrel there to the individual marks hashed around the section on the left, the line that when they align, you know that you are on the, in this case, 3rd position. You've turned this to what would correspond to a number 3 cut on the key. And if that's where you feel it settle, you jot that down. So by the end, when you open up the lock, not only have you opened the lock, but you also have the code to reproduce a key. And ABIS doesn't encrypt their keys whatsoever, so you can request a key cut just by giving them the direct bidding, and they'll mail it to you. Which I did with Emmanuel Goldstein's name because I thought I was really cool at the time. Additionally, the striations running around the barrel let you know what disk you are working on at any given time. And I think almost most importantly, in order to help you differentiate between the false gates and the true gates, using the amount of movement that you get. This piece here with the hash marks is the part that's turning when you're manipulating the wafers. Watching the amount of movement that you get when you are locked into a gate will tell you if you're in a false gate, because you will not be able to move very far, or a true gate where you will get a significant amount of freedom and movement inside of that lock, because the tolerance of the true gate is much more open than the tolerance of the false gates, and it's one of the easiest ways to tell if you're caught up in a false gate or a true gate, which can be a real bastard otherwise. So you can use those marks to indicate to yourself, you know, where you're at and where you're working in the lock. Additionally, you can, if you're getting caught up not being able to figure out whether you're in a false gate or a true gate, we know a lot about locks when we approach them. We know a lot about individual brands of locks, be they pin tumblers, be they disk detainers, whatever the case may be. We know about ABISes that the true gates are mirrored by false gates 2 and 3 positions away from themselves. Now that might not seem amazing yet, but when you take that information across each of the disks that you're going to be working on, you can dramatically reduce the total key space as you're creating a chart for yourself that describes the code of the lock as you're picking it. These are all just small tools that we can use to accurately and quickly open this lock and determine the key code so that we can produce a key and open it forever. Yako made a really nice tool for this really specific lock. Okay, and really importantly, when it comes to picking disk detainer locks, what Datagram was saying earlier about the washers is incredibly important in the ABIS Plus and in several others. This won't apply to every lock that you work on, but the tip of this tool is very, very thin. And that's because when you overlay one disk over another, you can't just proceed into the next disk. They're blocking each other now. However, by their very nature, the spacers in purple there have to be completely open. They have to be completely open and completely stationary. So if we build the tip of our pick to be as thin as the washer, as that spacer, we're able to push just into the spacer and then rotate freely in that space, aligning ourselves to the opening of the next disk. We then push into that next disk, set it, and so on and so forth. I believe this will be it. Oop. So, the thicker portion is turning just the front 0 disk, which will start applying pressure to the sidebar. Now watch the thin tip as it moves forward. Yeah. Sets a disk, moves forward into the spacer, turns freely to align to the next disk, moves forward, sets that disk, turns in the spacer, etc., etc. So those spacers have to be there to allow the disks not to interact with one another while during normal use of the lock, but that is the feature that we use to allow us to move through and manipulate each of the individual disks in the lock. And it opens. Oh, hello, friend. All right. Okay. Yako's story with Abus actually started with a really cool attack for the Abus Plus. He eventually built this tool, the Abus pick and decoder tool, as a response to Gerhard Mechbach, the president of the Abus Corporation. The reason, yeah, it's a good name, I know. The reason that he was in contact with old Gerhard to begin with was because of this. Now, it's a little bright, so you can't quite see what's going on. I might even march over there and just yell at you, actually. Okay, so what Yako discovered when he pulled one of these apart was that right here, we'll see the number 6. It's very light in the projection. But what he discovered is that each disc was actually stamped with the corresponding key count. Now, they weren't facing outward. They weren't facing toward the user. You couldn't just poke around in there and look at it. But if you applied a tacky substance, pushed past the disk you wanted to impression, turned 90 degrees and pulled backward, when one disk was overlaid over another 90 degrees, you would still get just enough of that number that when you pulled your tacky piece of whatever out, you would see clearly the impression of that number and be able to decode the lock just by looking behind the disks. It was awesome, yes. So Yako, with myself and a guy named Michael Hubler, was able to get in touch with the Abus Corporation. MH, Michael Hubler, was the main point of contact on that, did a lot of work to make that happen. Gerhardt said, good work, very good, we will get rid of the stamped discs. So on their factory line now, you'll get mixed cylinders, where some discs will be stamped, some discs won't, because they probably had millions of the stamped discs, so they weren't just going to toss them. But you can no longer use this attack to fully open or decode a lock. However, he also sent Yako, boom, nice, very nice. Nobody's clapping with you. He opened a lock, come on! Dicks. Using Yako's tool. I'll show a video of how that works in just 1 second. Actually, you saw the 3D animation. Do you need to see the live video too? Yeah, 3D animation is how it works. Okay. So Gerhardt actually sent Yako a lock without a key of the new mixed cylinder and said, if you can send me back the bitting, which is the combination of cuts, if you can send me back the bitting, I will send you the keys and this will be your trophy. And so Yako invented this tool and decoded the lock, wrote the whole thing down, sent it back to him, and received the keys. This is one of my favorite stories from 2009 or whenever that was.
Okay, so I didn't realize to put the company name. I don't mean to out them, but this is the Ebola Classic pick. I think sucks. They also make an Abus Plus tool, which is fairly similar to Yako's tool, although in the photo, this is a back tension lock. As you can see by the tension piece is very large, so that wouldn't be able to fit between the discs. I just noticed this.
Yeah, that's weird. You can tension on the profile if you want to, but that's...
Yeah, it's just a different way of doing it. So this is the opposite way of tensioning it from Yako's tool. But they both look very similar. They also have the scales for decoding and knowing which disk you're working with. This is a... You want to talk about it?
Yeah, sure. Ford TibPick's one of my favorite. So for Tibby? I've heard it both ways. No, whatever. Okay. So TibLock I like. It's a disk detainer lock for automobiles who've seen very little innovation over the years and tend to be very easy to open. But what this does, what I love about this tool, is that each of the heads are connected directly to each of those little thumb things. Oh, words. I don't know the technical terms for any of this stuff. Basically, you can manipulate every disk in the lock at once. without having to move anything. You push on one of those, you manipulate the disk associated with that. It runs through the whole thing. And it's a very cool tool to watch people use because they kind of like slap it to one side, slap it to the other side, wiggle around a little bit, and the thing opens up, and it's amazing. And then they have the key and can reproduce and everything. It's a very cool tool. I love it a lot. And what I like most about it is that I think that it could lead to a brute forcing tool that would open most American bike locks in probably under 3 minutes. But more about that in a second. That's you.
So when we give lock talks, I hope you all realize that despite our international fame and acclaim and all that, that we're mostly just two assholes on a stage at LayerOne.
Primarily. I was rapping, for God's sakes.
There are a lot of government level tools to open these locks, and the reason for that is because they are government level locks. A lot of governments use these locks for very important stuff. And so obviously there's an associated market for making tools that will open them. These are some very cryptic photos of different opening and decoding tools made by a company called False Safe Securities from the UK. They make a lot of tools, not just disk tools, but a lot of different tools for a lot of different amazing locks. And you can see mostly they're very similar. Most of these will also come with what's called a makeup key, which we'll talk about in a moment, I believe.
Yeah, we can run through those photos just off the slides.
These are not it. Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
And what a makeup key is that if you pick the lock, that's great, but what if you want to pick it again? And it took an hour and a half the first time. Well, you don't want to sit there picking it again for an hour and a half, so you'll use these tools to decode the lock, and then instead of making a real key, you might not have the time to go back and do that, because some of these keys are
taking the time
difficult
to
make.
order them or whatever, yeah.
So what you'll have is a tool that has all the different key cut possibilities, and you basically assemble a key. And you assemble the key to whatever bitting you want, and then you could use that as a fake key, but it also still opens the lock. Because essentially, you know, obviously, keys are just pieces of metal that move other pieces of metal, and they're in the right places. So.
Best tool to open any lock is the key. We love making keys.
The Lagarde that we passed around also has a commercially made tool made by Lock Defeat Technology. And you see it's very fancy, but it's essentially just the same thing, where it's just the picking end as well as the tensioner. And they also have the scale to decode while you pick.
If I wasn't a dick and had shipped Datagram the cutaway a month ago when I told him I would, he was going to build a tool, so that's on me.
2013, baby.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so last LayerOne, this photo is from a couple of days after last LayerOne. Very brief story about last LayerOne. I showed up, I was supposed to be staying with a friend in LA for 3 days to catch up with an old friend from school. He, when I arrived, said, "Oh, I'm not in the state. Sorry, I totally forgot." Arrived at the rental car company. They gave me a convertible for no extra money because I was really late and they didn't have my car, and they were very nice. And so right after LayerOne, I don't think I even stuck around for any like Sunday festivities or anything. I got in that convertible and I drove the circumference of California, and it was the best road trip I've ever taken in my life. Yeah, well, so, but the plan the whole time, some guy, the Narav Patel, really cool guy, was hanging out in some IRC channel talking to people about the fact that he had started rep producing keys for Schlage and Quickset locks. Somebody in this random IRC channel says, "Oh, you need to tell Schuyler Towne about that." So he sends me an email talking to these IRC, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, "Oh, fantastic. He's in the Bay Area." I was in LA at the time, and I was like, "Oh, cool. I'm going to drive up to your house." And he was like, "That's all right." And like day 2, I've like driven through the desert. Now I'm like in the woods. I'm like, "I'm going to be in your house in a day." And he's like, just didn't reply to my email. So I'm 6 hours from his house, and I'm like, "Hey, bro, I could really use an address because I'm coming to your house." And finally he was like, "All right, fine, okay." He like ordered some wings. We watched some Despicable Me, which turns out to be a really cute movie, actually. I recommend it. It's really good. There are like orphans in it, which I didn't get from the previous. Anyway, also, sorry, this has nothing to do with locks. When I showed up, 2 old drinking buddies of mine from my local bar in Boston happened to live with them. Tiny world. Okay, so I show up and I say, "Hey, this is fantastic. All of you wonderful non-lock nerds that say, hey, I want to do something with locks. Every damn one of you solves for Quickset and Schlage. We don't need you to solve for Quickset and Schlage. Quickset and Schlage are solved for if you look at a key. Like, I can sight read Quickset and Schlage keys. There's a group called the Everyday Carry Community that put beautiful photographs of their keys on the internet, and all I want to do is mail their keys to them and say, oh, you forgot something on the internet, idiot. Anyway, I have a folder on my laptop just called Creepin', where I associate people's keys with their Google Maps, like house. Anyway.
You know this is being recorded.
I know. I'm just talking now. I'm talking. My sister's in the FBI. All right. Why would I have said that? Okay, so I show up at his house and I say, this is fantastic. We don't need people to solve for Quickset and Schlage. It's really boring, and like you guys are doing amazing stuff, but apply it to something cool. I happen to have a pile of the ABIS Pluses because, again, that was my obsession last year. I said, do you think you could make one of these? Do you think that you could make a key for this lock? And we sat down, I was figuring out measurements. We were trying to actually get on the horn with Jaakko in Finland, but he didn't wake up for several more hours after I had left. And just via guesswork and him working in OpenSCAD or something like that, if that's, okay, anyway. He was typing like crazy and it was making amazing key shapes on the computer. It was incredible. It looked like actual, like real physical world hacking. It blew my mind. Okay, we didn't know what we were doing. We didn't have the specs. We had no idea, but just via guesswork after 5 hours, that key, this key, opened the lock that I had left with him. It was 1 a.m. I left after thinking that we were failures, and I got an email from about half an hour later saying, you know what, I went back to the lock and I played around with it a little bit. I put the key back in and I just tweaked it a little bit and it popped right open for me. And so this is very cool because he's now rep printing keys to moderate security locks compared to moderate security locks for this country right now. But the really crazy thing, the crazy implication is the fact that the soft plastic allowed for a miscut key to function in the lock. Here's why it's awesome. Okay, let's say that we want to attack locks that have slightly open tolerances with half cuts. So this is a 3.5 cut on a key. It turns the 4-disc to here. It turns our 3-disc to here. But if we are using a malleable enough material, because as you saw in the video and as we've repeated several times, that sidebar is being forced into the gates. The sidebar wants to go into the gates. If our material is at all malleable, the sidebar will force its way in and we'll open up the lock on a half cut. And so this is exponentially, actually, like how often do you really get to say exponential? Exponentially reducing the key space of the locks that we're attacking. Now, okay, so take that idea and now apply it to the 4-tib idea where you're manipulating each disk at once. Okay, so you have 6 cuts. You have 6 typical cuts in a key for most American disk detainer locks. Fine. You bring that down to 3 cuts. We're using half cuts. Great. Now you make it so that you can brute force your way through those 3 cuts. And there are bike locks out there that I've seen bike locks that only have 3 actual coded disks, and the 2 on the end are just 0 disks. So we always know how to set those. So it's a 5-disk lock, but there are only 3 disks that we need to figure out. 3 disks in 3 positions. 81? Somehow I got to 81 on a different slide deck. But 81! You can dial your way through 81 possible combinations in about a minute, probably. So you could literally just brute force your way through any lock that you find. Additionally, the real fear is that we're going to find ourselves in another Bic pen situation where if we're using malleable enough materials, just bashing around, fuzzing our way inside of locks, it's not going to work on every bitting. It's not going to work if you have a really deep cut against a really shallow cut because your malleable surface isn't going to be able to make that transition cleanly enough. But any bitting that is close enough to one another, you're going to be able to fuzz open in 10, 15 seconds, just like the Bic pens used to. So it's a very exciting moment, and all because I insisted on being a total creeper and showing up at that guy's house. He did most of the work. Boom. Oh, and it opens.
One other fun thing is that, like we talked about, replicating these keys, getting a real key for if you know the code can be challenging. So that's why setup keys exist. That's why Schuyler thought of this. If you have physical access to a key, and this is something we talked about 2 years ago at DEF CON, you can actually just cast one. You can take the key, make a mold of it, and then cast it with whatever material you want. So in this photo is an Abloy ProTech key. On the bottom is a casted version of the key. And so it's obviously not 100% perfect, but it opens the lock, which is the only important part.
and as intimidating as the keys looked for these types of locks, they cast beautifully.
And the reason for that is because they have such a solid core. So there's no heavy undercutting and there's no real weak points. You know, if you think of a traditional pin tumbler key, they can have very deep cuts, which makes it considerably more fragile. But all the disc locks have very sturdy keys, which lends itself to making very sturdy casted keys. Oh, well,
Oh, sorry.
we talked about this.
Yep.
And that is basically it. We flubbed and put a slightly older version of the slideshow.
I see. Yep.
But that is basically it. Schuyler wanted to show you some other tools.
Yeah, just pull those up and we can
Start here?
Yeah, just scan through them and I'll explain what's going on. Okay, so this is a guy who made his own decoder for. Here, I'll talk into this. This is a guy who made his own decoder for Abloy Classic locks. Almost certain that I found these in the advanced section of lockpicking101.com. Found them in my computer in old resources. I feel terrible that I cannot give this person the credit they are due, but they're part of the LP101 community, that much I'm sure of. All right, that little tip right there, just go right ahead, is going to actually slide along the exterior, well, up and through the discs. You'll see a picture in a second in order to discover the gate. Go ahead. Go ahead. Okay, so, that's kind of hard to see. You see where the discs are separating from one another? That's the tip of that. Yeah, perfect. That's the tip of that actually erupting up through, separating the discs, and then it grinds along the outside of that disc until it feels the gate. And the guy has a gauge. Go ahead. So that he can discover where that gate has appeared. All right, next. Yeah, that's the marks. That's the gauge. Oh, there's two of it, sorry. Gauge, fine. Here we go. Okay, so he didn't have like traditional materials to make a makeup key from, so he actually just took a bunch of keys for Abloy Classic locks and sliced them into pieces and cut little openings into them so that he can stack them. Go ahead. So here's a piece on the end. This piece is permanently attached to his makeup key because this is going to be turning the disc in the back of the lock, and every other one, gets stacked along. And using that method, it is a completely functional key. And so he has not only decoded it so he can make a key in a more permanent fashion later, but right now he can pop it open again as often as he needs to with his makeup key. Yeah, and this is just homebrew stuff, just some dude playing around with his locks.
One other thing that I just realized we didn't include was, so we talked about lockpicking, we talked about bumping, we talked about various forms of decoding. One thing we haven't talked about is impressioning. And so for those of you who don't know, you come to the village later on or tomorrow to learn more. But impressioning is a technique where you start with a blank key, and by forcibly trying to turn the components, in this case obviously disks, you leave marks on the key, and then you file those down, and then as the components start to go in the correct positions, the marks stop appearing, and eventually you have a working key. And this works on pin tumblers, this works on disc locks, pretty much every kind of lock that we have.
Yep. Basically anything that tentative method will work on will be impressioned.
Yeah. And so our friend Yeko also was working on impressioning the Abloy Classic. And again, it's kind of funny because the lock community, as far as the public eye goes, we seem to keep focusing on the older versions of Abloy because the new ones are just hard. So that might not be true of the not public community, but I found it very interesting. So what he did was he took a blank key and he cut little slices in between each key cut so that the material would deform easier. Because as a solid piece, it's harder to make a mark. So he cut all these little slots and then they would more easily deform. And then he had to figure out a way of making the angled cuts. I believe he ended up using a sandblaster or something ridiculous.
So some sort of like water plus bead blasting solution.
Because he wanted perfect rotations. Finland.
He's awesome.
Finland.
This guy's nuts.
And I think most of that stuff is up online on his blog. Unfortunately, the name of it isn't finished, so I don't remember it.
Can we unplug this just to come to our last slide?
Yes.
Cool. All right. We have to skip a slide that is sadly in this presentation. It shouldn't be. Sorry, secrets. But we'll bring you to our last slide with our resources so you can see that. And feel free to ask whatever questions you have. Here, I'll let you put that back there.
Oh, hey, we have his blog. Awesome.
Yeah, that's why I want that up there. Do it. Come on, baby.
Do it now. Oh. Okay. All right.
Okay.
So if you'd like to learn more about locks or disk locks or lockpicking or any of the fun stuff we usually give talks about, well, first and foremost, go to the Lockpicking Village. I heard they have locks there. You could also visit my website, lockwiki.com.
It's awesome, and I never go. And every time I'm like, oh man, check out this awesome thing I learned about this lock. And he's like, it's in an article on LockWiki, you dick. Every time. Happened earlier today.
Yep. You could also visit tool.nl. A lot of the ProTech and other Abloy photos I used were from Hanfei's Abloy articles, which are excellent.
Amazing.
And I believe they're linked on the front page of tool.nl. If not, search for Hanfei Abloy. And you
Write that down.
Yeah, write down Yako's blog because I don't know what that means. I think the name actually translates to disk lockpicking in Finnish, I believe. But I'm not sure. But he has a lot of stuff. He posts some stuff in English, some stuff in Finnish. But I believe there's a lot of information on his work with ABIS and Abloy and just disk locks in general. It's very, very informative. And then Schuyler has a number of tutorials on how to pick this particular ABIS lock on YouTube as well as his website.
Yep.
And you could use this link to jump to it.
It is my entirely vain personal URL shortener, pronounced Lock God.
I'd like to apologize.
Do you guys have any questions about anything? Yeah. What's the casting
The
material?
question is, what is the casting material? You can buy, it's a kit from a company called Illumilite, I believe. And I believe it's just silicon molding and urethane casting, I believe is the components. They have some different stuff. You could buy like a putty that you could just use to take a quick impression of keys. I mean, I think of this stuff that they sell all in terms of locks, but they're made for all sorts of casting and impressioning stuff. And then they sell like a beginner casting and molding kit that's just perfect for lock-related stuff. And again, you know, you have to consider if what you want to make a cast of is a two-part. If you need a two-part mold due to a lot of undercuts or whatever, but you know, I leave that in your capable hands. But the company's called Illumilite that I buy most of that stuff from.
I had an awesome time. A friend of mine's a food scientist, wrote a book a while back, and we wanted to collaborate. And so he said, why don't we impression keys in food safe molding so we can make candy keys?
And the Illumilite stuff is all food safe. And I always joke, like, in case you need to eat your mold of the key as you're running away.
Bam! We came very, very close to opening a 3KS with pure sugar. We just had a little too much flashing on the side. And my lock ended up being just filled with sugar.
Anyways, any more questions?
Somebody over here? Yes. Yeah, I know. This was like first week with Blender. I've played around with textures to a degree. I need to spend real time with it. Yeah.
Any other questions? Nope. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. So, in addition to being the guy on stage, I'm also with LayerOne. Later on tonight, we will have a very special party that you should not bring your children to. It will be here in the main room. I think we will be starting at about 9:30, and the entertainment happens at around 10, I believe. This is LayerOne. We don't have very fixed schedules, as you may have noticed. And in that time, you can enjoy the game room, Lockpicking Village, Hardware Hacking Village, kind of area. Everything else Anaheim, California has to offer. Have fun, and I'll see you guys later tonight.
And we need the locks back.
Yes, and please give me my fancy locks back. Yes, I would love my frog. Thank you.
It's pretty cool.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Notch.
is that part of the problem gets to key replication once you've got that information. So the real trick now is how fast can I make the key from
No worries. Come hang out in the village, and I'll show you on the cutaway with this tool. Yeah, I got a bunch of them laying over there. Cool. Awesome. This is.
So I mean, there's a limited number of
Wait, this
positions.
is. Oh, this must be.
of cut numbers, just like there's cut numbers on the pin tumbler. Just like there's cut numbers on the pin tumbler.
and they all have.
They all have their series
Yeah,
of
which
numbers.
is too thick to work in any other.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
What is the entertainment?
I don't know. I would assume that
You'll have to show up to find out.